Hang, I really like how you emphasized primary sources, and I really like how you emphasized doing research and how difficult it is to do research on the other side, even to this date. Can you say more about that? How does one do research? How do historians research the Vietnam War today, and how has that changed over time?
Oh, that's a good question, and that goes with Dean's question about where does one find primary sources. Okay, uh, it is do okay. Where do I even start? That's a huge question. Um, the archival landscape in Vietnam is still very it's dicey. Whereas you have no, actually I would say it's dicey here in the United States, especially with no longer are we actually undergoing any, especially under the Trump administration, there was no one working in the National Archives, and we didn't have this clear process in terms of declassification. In Vietnam, the three archives that would reveal the most about high-level decision making, that being the party archives, the foreign ministry archives, and the military archives, are still closed. And they're not only closed to foreign scholars, so non-national Vietnam scholars, they're closed to anyone who's not working in these agencies, in these bodies. So it's basically closed. And so it's, that while that's unfortunate, there are other sources that can get to, the questions that address war and peace, and strategy in Vietnam. And those are, basically there's what I've called the equivalent of the foreign relations of the United States, the Fruce volumes, and we have them on the North Vietnamese side,
Hmm.
and that's called Dang Kinh Dang, the party documents. Now they're heavily sanitized, censored, but they're published every year. We have them, and so we have of course, the huge period of the war, with 68 I think being the fattest volume, but we do have the equivalent of Fruce. And then, of course, on the South Vietnamese side, there's Texas Tech, in Lubbock, Texas, very close to, well, not super close to you guys, but they hold the largest archive on the Vietnam War on the Indo-Chinese side, and that's thanks to basically, don't tell them, but I told you guys. Well, I wonder if it's already common knowledge. Anyway, it used to belong to Berkeley. Berkeley no longer housed the Douglas Pike collection. Texas Tech got all this. They got a lot of money back in the 80s and basically offered to buy it. Berkeley, instead of selling it to them, would have either destroyed them. We don't know what happened. But in the middle of the night, Douglas Pike basically arranges U-Hauls and took all of the materials out of Berkeley, drove them across to Texas, where they now reside in Lubbock. And it was good that he did so, because now they've I think there's been another cut of the Berkeley Berkeley Library. But in any case, all of those materials are available, and they've been digitized. So in addition to these, sort of university libraries, these published collections, there's a lot of Vietnamese sources. Still, though, as one who wants to undertake this, in terms of research, it's really important to pay attention to current Vietnamese politics, in particular U.S.-Vietnamese relations. I always get more documents when relations are going well, and they've happened going, they've been pretty strong, the cooperation between the United States and Vietnam under Trump, and I can only hope that they continue under Biden. And that's, of course, because of the new Cold War that has fallen over the Asia Pacific region, and if you want to call what's going on between the United States and China, or this rebalancing. But what that actually means for Vietnam, in addition to benefiting from the trade wars, they're also benefiting from closer relations with the United States, and so they're willing to put forward more documents.
Gotcha. And Kelsey, of course, has. I was just thinking about it. Now you're reading my mind, Kelsey. She put up the link to the Texas Tech Archive. I know some of our teachers are in Lubbock or near Lubbock. So as you're, going and visiting the Buddy Holly Museum, you can also visit the archive, the Vietnam archive at Texas Tech, which is extraordinary. I mean, Hang is absolutely correct. So Jared Hutchinson has asked about American military advising, the advisory role, then moving into more direct engagement. How do you think about that transition? How do you talk about that transition? It's Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson in different roles, right?
Yeah, yes, it's a great question. And one of the things that I love, just, sort of emphasizing, this is why 1962 and Operation Beef Up got a not a shout out, whatever you highlighted in that period, that I was talking about, the sort of low level conflict 60 to 63 is, when Kennedy took office, Eisenhower kept it in the limit of the final declaration of the Geneva Accords. He stayed within the limits that that outside powers could have in terms of a presence in Vietnam. Kennedy blew it apart. He blew it apart, after the fall of 1961, when he sent his advisors to Saigon and said, hey, so what are we going to do? Saigon's position keeps crumbling. His advisors come back and say, well, don't listen to the JCS. Don't listen to those hawks. They just want you to keep, they want you to take it to the next level, to commit ground troops. Don't do that. We can just increase the number of advisors. Forget about the fact that those advisors, during the Kennedy years, definitely by 63, when you have the Green Berets, when you have American, when you have U.S. advisors actually leading patrols of ARVN soldiers, that they're participating in the fighting. And so again, this slippery rope between what they're calling, when Kennedy's reading the Taylor-Rostow report, and it's just like, so we're going to send 6,000, 8,000 advisors to help in the Mekong Delta due to the flooding. That's easy to put them in. How are you going to take them out?
Right.
And that's precisely, what happened. When Kennedy was assassinated, again, people make a big deal about, had he not been assassinated, he had made his intention to withdraw 1,000. Well, that's all fine, but when you have close to 20,000 advisors it's not 20,000, but again, it's in the teens, advisors by 1963, even though LBJ, again, took everything else about continuing Kennedy's legacy, except for withdrawing that token 1,000 advisors from the country, doesn't mean that Kennedy was going to withdraw, and had he lived, he would have. I mean, we can debate that. That's one of the great, that was another thing I should have done in teaching this course. There's all these what ifs, the counterfactuals, and of course one is always around, what if JFK had lived, what if Nguyen Diem hadn't been assassinated, all these counterfactuals. We don't know. I think we can look to, anyway. So that's great about advisors.
Well, and I think this is an interpretive issue that's really important, and you and I agree. So I want to highlight it that there is a lot of continuity from Kennedy to Johnson here, and the question of whether we could have stayed with advisors, which is part of this wonderful question, is, well, the advisors were already an interventionist force of a kind, and it's hard, and we were already going down a slope. Other historians will see a big break between Kennedy and Johnson, but I think you're saying, Hang, that from the Vietnamese perspective, there's actually a lot of continuity.
Yes. That is exactly what I'm sorry. I was looking over at the questions are coming in, yeah. And I just want to make sure that so yes, Jared, sort of positive impact. And as we get into the advisory aspect, and, once we, I didn't even get to the sort of military debates, US military debates in the Vietnam War. There are all these different factions. I mean, it really depends on if you thought, if you're reading Eric Boogeroyd and you're saying, there was, let's start with Colonel Harry Summers, that, his argument is that the United States could have won, the military could have won, but the civilian government basically made the military fight with one hand tied behind its back by not allowing the United States to cross the 17th parallel, by not allowing them to bomb harder, bomb faster, not, allowing going into Cambodia, Laos, et cetera, that, had the United States really waged a conventional war in the way that the military excelled at this point, that Vietnam could have been won. Now, those are the people who argue, those are the scholars who argue that, again, the big what if, and that we could have won. There was another, of course, school of interpretation that it didn't matter what military strategy you applied, be it William Westmoreland's, Creighton Abrams, if you focused on what the Marines were doing versus the Army, if you looked at counterinsurgency and pacification war, there's a whole school of interpretation that says no, nothing could win because the war was decided politically, not militarily. And so this question about the advisory role, it depends on when you're looking at it, at what distinct point, and from what perspective, which branch in particular. So it's a great question, one that really needs to be unpacked.
Yep, great. And you did a lot of that and gave us a lot to work with there. So Mary asks, takes your bait on Indonesia.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. All right. I love this. So, as I set up in my lecture, when I'm getting to this point about U.S. Move from involvement to intervention in Vietnam, is of course, I show that Eisenhower quote about, his domino theory, how he articulates it, and then, use. I quote McNamara a lot because he identifies Indonesia as the most important domino in the row of dominoes as it is being articulated. And as we see the events of what happens by 1965, and here I'm talking about the destruction of the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, and the move from Sukarno to Suharto. Suharto is a pro-US right military member of the military that really, sort of signifies to the United States that now we have a man we can count on in Indonesia versus Sukarno, who we couldn't stand. We couldn't stand him when he was fighting the Dutch, and we barely wanted. Of course, they didn't continue aiding the Dutch, but anyway, another story that his move left was too strong. That even though he put forward non-alignment, he really was about sort of strengthening the communists in his country and probably abroad. So that by 1965, Indonesia being the most important domino in Southeast Asia, by the end of 65, because of the move from Sukarno, the destruction of the PKI, one of Sukarno's triangle was taken out, allowing the military to overtake his government, and bringing Sukarno down meant that the most important domino was stabilized. It would not fall. This happened by late 1965. Look at Vietnam. If that were the case, and McNamara was the one who says this, that, okay, great, the domino is shored up, the domino that is Indonesia. And then you just take what he's doing in Vietnam, poured in at this point 180,000 US troops in South Vietnam. So that's a nice juxtaposition of, of taking the domino theory and bringing it all the way to 1965 and the pivotal role that Indonesia plays in this, and then juxtaposing it with non-action in South Vietnam is just, to me, tragic, because it could have just ended right there. But of course, this is where you get to, well, other things were on the line. Credibility. Oh, well, we've already sunk costs. Now we already have 100,000. Let's see what they can do.
Right. And just to articulate this really clearly, it's a great point, right? You're saying that they didn't have to worry about dominoes falling in the same way after 65 at Suharto. So clearly there was more at work here. Credibility is something that, we both emphasize in our research, other historians have emphasized. What do we mean by that? I find even for undergraduates, it's a difficult concept. Containment's an easier concept, right? Because we can show them a map and show after World War II the evidence, at least to many people, viewing the spread of communism with the Chinese Communist Revolution, et cetera. But what is credibility? What do you mean by that?
That's a great question. And here I conflated two things. One is that presidents making decisions based on when they feel like their nation's credibility is on the line and their own personal one.
Right.
So in the way that when credibility is discussed, as it pertains to presidents believing that the nation's credibility is on the line, is okay. So, you look at South Vietnam, if we don't begin the air war over North Vietnam, if we don't bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos, if we don't undertake these reprisal strikes against North Vietnamese installations in the Gulf of Tonkin, let's say, if we don't, introduce these ground troops, it's all showing our allies in the world that we're not going to aid them, we're not going to stand up to communist aggression. At the same time, credibility could also be, sort of used in, well, look, we also have to stand for what is it saying to our enemies. And so that nation's credibility is one thing vis-a-vis our allies, vis-a-vis our one can argue, to our enemies, and what's being projected in that sense. And then personal credibility, again, a lot of scholars subscribe to this interpretation, that it's more about, their own personal, how they'll go down in history as the historian that stood up, or the historian that was weak and lost Vietnam.
Right. No, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. There is the credibility of being a power that doesn't back down, and there's the credibility of being a person who wins. And especially if you're Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, and you're concerned that people will say, "Look, Kennedy could have done it better." It's very hard to back down. So we have one more.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry, I
please.
just want to say credibility also plays a factor on the other side. That was the whole thing about Lien-Hang and his general offensive general. I mean, they're all thinking about how they're going to be written about and their own, credibility in their spheres, in their worlds. And for Lien-Hang, it's all about, I got to make my mark in the revolutionary world. Mao's got his strategy, Fidel's got his, I have mine, and it's the general offensive general uprising.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think we have time for one more question from Jared. Again, did an American sense of morality play a role at all in our Vietnam involvement, or was it more political and about credibility? And I guess the morality here would be about trying to actually, as Lyndon Johnson claimed, make the lives of Vietnamese better. Do you see that as a motivating factor? Was there, as Lloyd Gardner has argued, right, was there an idealism that drove the United States to war here?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I identify this, sort of American sense of morality and individual decisions to serve in Vietnam much more than sort of politicians' rationales for committing troops to Vietnam. So I think that definitely existed in the United States and among specific or certain Americans. I'm much more cynical when it comes to looking at our leaders and the decisions they took. And again, maybe I have to kind of get past the very top or certain leaders, and we'll see that, sort of in, well, actually, I think you can. I think you can even Congress. Looking at, I just taught the Gulf of Tonkin today and looked at the dissenters, but even Fulbright, at this point and what he does after helping Gulf of Tonkin resolution go through, he also brings about the Fulbright hearings to atone for helping with the passage of that resolution, to show, that the American war effort is basically wrongheaded and bankrupt. I mean, this is what he does. He's decrying, he's standing up against, what American soldiers and American intervention had done to Vietnam in creating Saigon and making it into a brothel. He makes these comments by 1966. So I do think that there's a strong sense of American sense of morality. It's not at the very top, but I do think it's there, and you do see this in reasons for why soldiers serve, or why congressmen either supported or then later on came out against the war effort.
Yeah, I think it's such a great point you make, Hang, and a great question from Jared. I mean, I would just add that there's certainly morality at play in the debates about the war at home. The anti-war movement is driven by a very strong moral impulse. And those who are anti-war, who are not necessarily pro-war, but those who are angry at the anti-war movement, they're also driven by a very strong moral impulse. There's a wonderful moment in 1967 that's been described by a few individuals, a few scholars, myself among many others, when Dick Cheney and his wife Lynn Cheney are at the University of Wisconsin. They're graduate students, and they attend and see some of the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. The students are condemning the United States for not living up to its ideals. They're making a moral argument. But the Cheneys are morally repulsed by what they see, because they think these students are undemocratic. They think these students are condemning what America has done, and they think they're being disrespectful to the soldiers. Both sides are making moral arguments. It's actually not a policy argument. What turns the Cheneys to the right is a moral response to the anti-war movement, and what draws people to the anti-war movement is a moral response to American action. Neither are really making policy analyses, and I think you captured that also at the policy level really well.